services, I would very much appreciate that. Just want to mention a couple of things to you. I want you to take your Bible, if you would, and turn to Luke 23. Luke 23. I want to talk to you tonight. It's a lesson. We're going to talk a little bit about the crucifixion of Jesus. Actually, we're going to talk a lot about the crucifixion of Jesus. But it's to make a point that may be a little bit different than what you might think. I want to begin in Luke 23, beginning in verse 33. And when they had come to the place called Calvary, there they crucified him, and the criminals on one, the right hand, and the other on the left. And Jesus said, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do. And they divided his garments and cast lots, and the people stood looking on. But even the rulers with them sneered, saying, He saved others, let him save himself, if he is the Christ, the chosen of God. The soldiers also mocked him, coming and offering him sour wine, and saying, If you are the King of the Jews, save yourself. And an inscription also was written over him in letters of Greek, Latin, and Hebrew. Then one of the criminals who were hanged blasphemed him, saying, If you are the Christ, save yourself and us. But the other answering rebuked him, saying, Do you not even fear God, seeing that you are under the same condemnation? And we indeed justly, for we receive the due reward of our deeds, but this man has done nothing wrong. Then he said to Jesus, Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus said to him, As surely I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise. Now it was about the 6th hour, and there was darkness over all the earth until the 9th hour, and then the sun was darkened, and the veil of the temple was torn in two. And when Jesus had cried out with a loud voice, he said, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. And having said this, he breathed his last. The passage that we have read is Luke's description of the things that happened at the crucifixion. But really what is said about the crucifixion is pretty minimal. It really tells us nothing about crucifixion. Have you ever noticed that? For something to be so significant, yet we don't have hardly anything that records the nature of crucifixion. I think that's interesting. Matthew's gospel says, Then they crucified him, and that's the extent of it. Mark's gospel says when they crucified him. Luke's gospel, as we have read, says there at Calvary they crucified him, and John's gospel said where they crucified him. None of the four gospels writers offer any real description of the crucifixion, and it probably is because the original audiences didn't need any definition or description of the crucifixion. I think we have noted many times that the writers of the New Testament knew their audience. And when they mentioned crucifixion, a very vivid picture came into the minds of their audiences, because they saw that crucifixion on a regular basis. And so I think that's probably why the initial audience did not need any greater description. Now we sometimes talk about and preach about the crucifixion, and we can deduce from research of looking at older documents and looking at things of what historians tell us, we can surmise some things, and we can think about some things that crucifixion did involve. But there is something in the story of the crucifixion, as the four gospel writers talk about it, that I want to talk to you about tonight, because I think it packages and almost puts bookends around the one point that I want to make at the close of this lesson that I think may be valuable for us to think about. I want to talk about the shameful crucifixion of Jesus. And I want to talk about it because Jesus had to endure so many indignities and so much shame, and that is what's present in these accounts. It's not the cross itself and how that was and where the nails were put in his feet, or where they put in his wrist or in his hands and his palm. It's not about that. It's about what he endured and the shamefulness of the resurrection. And I think we need to see those. The Greco-Roman world knew the significance of a shameful crucifixion. That's what crucifixion was about. It was what slaves were executed with. That's how they were executed. And they wanted the shamefulness of that to be seen to those who would look up and those who would see these people being hung on these crosses. It's Cicero himself, who was a Roman historian and politician, who said, he said, a Roman citizen should remove crucifixion even from his thoughts and his eyes and his ears. In other words, Roman citizens don't even need to think about it. Don't let it ever cross your mind, because that's something that only takes place for those who need it. It's reserved for those who need to be executed and killed that way. Crucifixion was execution taken to a new level of shame. But the shame was for the victim. The Romans wanted crucifixion to make a statement, and it did. And it especially did as Rome was making a point to Jerusalem and to those Jews who lived in Palestine. They wanted to keep the peace there, and crucifixion was one way they helped keep the peace. I want you to look at something with me from Deuteronomy 21. When you look at this, you may think crucifixion, but when you read this carefully, you realize this is not about crucifixion. Crucifixion had not even been developed yet. No one at this time really knew about crucifixion. Notice what is said here. This was the Mosaic Law. If a man has committed a sin deserving of death, he is put to death, and you hang him on a tree, his body shall not remain overnight on the tree. But you shall surely bury him that day, so that you do not defile the land which the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance. For he who is hanged is accursed of God. And what you have here is a Mosaic law that was implemented when it came to capital punishment, when it came to what one did with the body. This passage, as I said, is not talking about crucifixion. This passage is talking about a corpse that is hung, and the corpse is hung for display purposes. And it's hung on a tree so as to warn those who look at it to say, you don't want to happen to you what's happened to this particular victim. And the law said that you only allow a body to stay there for that day. And at the end of the day, you take it down and you bury it. And you bury it because if you don't, it defiles the land. It is accursed of God. That's what that body is. It's accursed of God. So you've got to take care of that. And so think what the Jewish mind thought about their law and how the Romans had amped up this idea of being accursed of God. Now, again, this is not the same thing. But when the Jews saw the crucifixion of Christ, they looked up there and in essence they saw, okay, He is being hung on a tree. This is after the fact. This point that I'm making here, I'm pointing to that because that's what I see. This point is after the fact. He's already dead. And you hang Him on a tree so that people see Him. And so when Jesus is killed, He is in essence, He already hung on a tree. He is accursed of God. The execution itself is done on a tree, and the public viewing of it came right along with it. This is 2 in 1. The crucifixion of Christ was 2 in 1. And that's exactly what the Romans wanted the Jews to see. This person who is up here on this tree is accursed of God. And in addition to this, there are several things in Luke 23 that I want us to think about tonight as we go further in this lesson. These are what I would call shameful indignities. These are things that when you read the text, and we've already read the text out of Luke 23, these are things that are stated that just further amp up the difficulties that Jesus faced. So I want you to look at those with me. We're not going to take a long time to look at this, but I want you to notice these things. Verse 33 tells us that there were criminals on both sides of Jesus. Now, if there are 3 who are being hung and there are criminals on both sides, what do you think people thought that the middle one was? Well, he's a criminal too. So basically what you have are 3 criminals. The message is that Jesus was a criminal too, yet we all know. What's ironic about that is Jesus wasn't a criminal in any sense, not in any sense. And yet, The Romans wanted them to see him as a criminal, and certainly the Jews did. And then another shameful aspect of this is that they divided his garments and cast lots. Verse 34 tells us that. I want you to think about the indignity of this. I think it's hard for us to understand because, first of all, crucifixion doesn't happen anymore. And second of all, none of us obviously have experienced it. Here is a man who is hanging on a cross. He's not dead yet. Yet they take his garments and they play games, in essence. We don't know exactly what it was, if it was a matter of picking sticks or throwing dice. We don't know what the casting of lots really means. We don't know how they did that. But it was a way of selection. And so with the garments, when they stripped him of his garments, as the text tells us, he is, notice this, he's completely exposed. I don't think we gather that sometimes. Crucifixion was a complete exposure. When we see pictures of Jesus hanging on a cross, we see garments that are covering his midsection. That's not the way it was. They stripped him of his garments, and he is exposed. And then they cast lots to determine who gets the souvenir, if you will. And so what you might expect after the lots are cast and the garments are stripped, what you might expect is that the people stood by, and they stood by looking at him. The text tells us that they stood by looking on. They're staring at an unclothed man hanging on a cross, watching him in his shame, watching him in his pain, watching him in his indignity. Yet what they're watching and who they're watching is the Son of God, the Son of the Creator of the universe, the one who ultimately was with the Father in the beginning. Mark's account tells us that those who passed by and blasphemed him. And you remember what it says about them? They wagged their heads. I think that's significant. It's as if to say, look at him. Look at this poor man. It's almost as a way to say, I pity him. Look at him. Thinking he is the Son of God, and he's a criminal, and they've put him to shame. And so some pass by, Mark says, wagging their heads. And it gets worse than this. The rulers also with them, with the people, verse 35 says, the rulers sneered at them. Here are the leaders leading the sneering. They're leading the mocking, and they said, notice what they said, he saved others, let him save himself, if he is the Christ, the chosen of God. Well, the truth of the matter is, he could have saved himself. And had Jesus saved himself, not only would the narrative of the story been different, but the narrative of history would have been different. If he would have chosen to save himself. We oftentimes sing the song, 10,000 Angels. He could have called 10,000 angels. I know he could. I don't know that it would have taken 10. I probably could have called one and said, help me down from this cross. And him being who he was, could have demanded that, and I believe could have seen to it that that happened. But he chose not to do that. And may I say about these leaders leading in the sneering, you know, when the leaders mock, when the leaders jeer, what do you think that does to the people? You know, sometimes we want to back off. You know, we're at a ball game, we don't like a call. You know, everybody catch on this. You know, we don't know. That umpire didn't know what he was doing, but we're not going to say too much until we see the coach going nuts. Until we see, you know, a few others that we think, well, if they do it, I can do it. And that's kind of what's happening here. The rulers did that. And so the people obviously feel freer to do that as well. And so it just adds to the shame and indignity of the moment. And I think these things are here for a reason. In verse 36 says this, the soldiers mocked him, offering sour wine. You know, the kings of the ancients had cupbearers and they had wine bearers. And when the king wanted the wine, they would pour the sweet wine. And so, in essence, what they're saying is, Yes, he's a king, but he's not the kind of king that deserves the best wine. Matter of fact, he's a king who's not really a king, so we're going to give him the sour wine. So that's what they do. And again, this whole picture is a picture of mockery and shamefulness. And as if that's not all, there was an inscription. And notice this, it was an inscription for all to read. They don't want anybody left out. Well, I can't read Greek. I'm a Hellenistic Jew. Okay, then we're going, we'll put up that for you. We'll put up your language for you. If you live in Palestine, we'll put up Greek. And if you're a Roman, we'll put up Latin. So it's written in Hebrew, Greek, and Latin for everybody to see. And it says, this is the King of the Jews. And again, he was the King of the Jews. But that's not why they put it up there. It was a mockery. It was an idea. It was contempt. It was shame. And may I suggest that what may be the most incredible thing is what Jesus didn't do. 1 Peter 2 says this, for to this you were called because Christ also suffered for us, leaving an example that you should follow his steps, who committed no sin, nor was deceit found in his mouth, who, when he was reviled, did not revile in return, and when he suffered, he did not threaten. That was totally what Jesus did, but that was totally different than what commonly happened. He did not revile. He did not threaten. If you'd been hung on a cross, if you were being shamed, if you were being met with all these indignities, you probably realize how most people responded, correct? You hurled the kind of insults that you would otherwise never hurl if you had the ability, if you had the strength, if you had the physical stamina to say something, you would hurl these vile and indignant insults. That's all a victim could do if they had any strength left. And yet Jesus did none of it. As a matter of fact, the centurion, as we're told, a soldier later reacted to Jesus' death by saying, certainly this was a righteous man. That's what Luke's account says. Mark's account says, truly this man was the Son of God. That was his reaction. That was his conclusion. That he's so different. And Peter reminded him later on, several years later after the death of Christ, Peter reminds them, this is how you need to be. And you need to be reminded that's what Jesus had done. No reviling, no threatening. May I ask you a question? Is that how you respond? Is that how you respond when people mistreat you? And we're talking about something for all of us that's nowhere near what Jesus went through. We're not talking about the kind of shame and indignity that Jesus went through. We're just talking about someone maybe saying something bad about us or doing something bad to us. That's what we're talking about. We want to be treated with respect and dignity and honor. And when we're not, sometimes we take that into our own hands. And my point to this is, if anybody could have said, wait a minute, I don't deserve this, it's Jesus Christ. But I want you to notice something that's packaged in all these things that I mentioned that we haven't talked about yet. And this is really the point. Then Jesus said, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do. We talked a little bit about that in the auditorium class this morning. Some good conversation about that, good discussion, and good questions and good answers, I believe, about that. This is an incredible response. Because don't you, I don't think I'm reading too much into this. This statement of Jesus, Luke records this statement in the midst of all this shame and indignity going on. I think what the writers do is they're not talking about the crucifixion itself. They're talking about the circumstances around the crucifixion. And in the midst of it, Jesus says, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they're doing. I think there's some things for us to think about here. We've talked a lot this year, and we're going to continue to talk the rest of the year about this legacy worth following. And the second lesson, if you look at your booklet that we passed out at the beginning of the year, the second lesson for this month has to do with modeling forgiveness. And I want to focus on the word modeling. It is looking at someone who is the epitome and who is the ideal person to show us what that kind of forgiveness is. Here is the Son of God who understands that forgiveness is one's greatest need. Maybe, and there are a variety of ways. Somebody could say, well, it's salvation, it's being right with God. There's all sorts of ways to package and to say what we're all trying to say. But forgiveness is the thing that we all need. And Jesus and Stephen knew that. And I want to give you my take about that. Acts tells us that Stephen was one of those men who was selected to take care of the problem. In the distribution, when the Grecian widows were being neglected, Stephen was one of the men who was chosen to help take responsibility for that and see to it that those things happen. Now the text tells us that he was a man full of the Holy Spirit. According to Scripture, he is the first non-apostle to ever perform miracles. We're told that. And I think because he was full of power, and I think that's indicative of the fact that he could perform those particular acts. But even after he said what he said, and those people reacted to him and began to stone him, and when he himself said, Father, forgive them, because they don't know what they're doing. Please forgive them. That was in essence what Stephen said as well. When I look back at that, I go, what is it that Jesus and Stephen understood that we don't understand? Or maybe that's difficult for us to understand. And I believe it's this. I believe Jesus understood what separation from God would mean more than anybody else. I mean, the apostles could preach about it. They could talk about it. But don't you think more than anybody else, Jesus would understand if people are separated from God eternally, that is going to be, as we talked about this morning, there's no way they can comprehend that. And I think that's one of the motivations. I don't think it's the only motivation, but I think that's one of the motivations for Jesus himself to staying on that cross when he could have called 10,000 angels. He knew what it was about. He knew if he didn't, he knew the consequence for mankind. Not just a man or a few men, for every man. Had Jesus not stayed on the cross and died and been resurrected, none of us would be going to heaven. None of us would have a chance for heaven. None of us that wouldn't even be on anybody's radar. And so when Jesus is hanging here on the cross and these insults and all these shameful indignities are going on around him, the one thing among a few things, but in the midst of all that, even in all that, he says, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they're doing. Now, I don't believe that they were forgiven because Jesus requested it, any more than I believe those who killed Stephen were forgiven because he requested it. I believe what Jesus and Stephen both did is they were characterizing the human spirit. And they were doing that in a way that not many other people knew about. Certainly no human being other than Jesus himself. But you remember when Stephen looked up, he saw the Son of Man standing there, ready to welcome him. And so I think Stephen saw it in a different way as well. And so they understood. I believe they understood what it meant to forgive. And I'm not saying that no one else does, and I'm not saying that anyone in Scripture doesn't understand it, or that we don't. But I think they had a perspective that may be important for us to think about. Why do we have such a hard time forgiving people? Well, maybe it's because sometimes we've been mistreated. Oftentimes it's because we've been mistreated. One of my most vivid memories as a kid, I think I've told y'all this story. We lived in a little house when I was a little boy. I must have been about 6, and my sister Anita was probably 4, and we shared a room. There were basically 2 bedrooms. My mom and dad had a room, and Anita and I had a room. Maybe a little younger than that, because I don't think Tamara was around yet, my youngest, so it was probably even younger than that. And at night, we'd go to bed, and we'd have to leave the door open because, as I told you before, we had that attic fan in our house and didn't pull that air through. We didn't have an air conditioner. So we would turn that fan on, and it would pull that air through. And I can remember one night, my father was watching television. My mom may have been in there, but a marble flew from the room that Anita and I were in, and it hit the TV screen. And I thought, that's not good. And my dad marched in there and picked me up out of the bed and wore me out. And my sister was lying in her bed laughing about what was going on, because Anita was the one who had thrown the marble, not me. And after the beating was over, and I use that term literally, not in a bad way, you understand. My dad didn't beat me like that, but he knew that was something I shouldn't do. And after it was over, and he had calmed down a little bit, Anita said, "Dad, Kenny didn't do that, I did." And he looked at her and he said, "Don't do that again." I thought, wait just a minute. Oh, I've taken all this punishment and I didn't even do it. And what she gets is, don't do that again. And that's what happened. And there was injustice there. There was injustice there. And sometimes there is injustice. You know, sometimes when people mistreat us and say things, and we know that we have a right to want forgiveness. And it's just hard for that to happen. Sometimes injustice is done. Sometimes justice is done. So that's the nature of the court system even. And I may not have been guilty on that occasion, but I can tell you other times, there were times I was guilty that I didn't get any punishment. And I don't know if Dad was thinking about that or not. I might have done something just earlier in the day. I don't know that. But I guarantee there were times when I was guilty and I didn't get punished. But the only person I've ever known who was absolutely innocent is Jesus Christ. I don't find it hard to believe, but it's hard for me to grasp that Jesus was perfect. He wasn't guilty of sin. But if anyone could have fought back and been right in doing so, it would have been Jesus. If anybody could have and should have come down off the cross in terms of getting even, it could have been Christ. But he didn't. And Jesus didn't come down off the cross. As a matter of fact, in the midst of all this, what he did was ask God to forgive these people, because he knew that their sins, if they weren't forgiven, would separate them from God, like we talked about this morning. And then the passage that we did talk about in class this morning that says this in Matthew 6, "If you forgive men their trespasses, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. But if you do not forgive men their trespasses, neither will your Father forgive your trespasses." I don't think this is as hard as we sometimes make it. I'm not saying that we know everything about it. But I'm going to tell you what that says to me. If you want God to forgive you, then you need to forgive those who have trespassed against you. And if you're unwilling to do that, in whatever capacity you think, in whatever circumstance you think you find yourself, all you need to do is go back and read Luke 23. And I think what Jesus is saying here, even before He was crucified, is, use me. And that's what Peter's saying, I think, in 1 Peter 2. Show how Christ had suffered. And so I think this lesson is trying to package how we forgive. It's a lesson about crucifixion and about what Jesus went through, yes, but it's mainly a lesson about how we react to that and what we need to do. Having looked at Jesus, is there any situation or person that should keep us from being the model of forgiveness? I know it's hard. But is there someone or someones out there with whom you have a broken relationship because there has not been, at least on your part, the willingness to forgive? If that is the case, I want you to think about it. It's hard to do, but yet I think it's something we must do. Let's not let anyone or anything or any attitude or disposition of heart that we might have towards somebody else who may have done us an injustice. Let's not let anything like that separate us from the God who wants to forgive us. May we be people who, when we pass from this life, may we be those who are a model of forgiveness. I know it's hard sometimes. But you know when I think about, and sometimes I say this, to you, sometimes you'll hear me say, and like I have tonight, I know that's hard. Well, Christianity's hard. There are a lot of things about living for Christ and being a Christian that are hard to do. But that doesn't mean that we can pass it off and not do it. That just means we have to work harder to be who we ought to be. And that happens by growing every day and becoming better. So, I think what the lesson, I pray, will do is will encourage all of us to evaluate ourselves and ask ourselves some pretty hard questions.